Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. This documentary examines an absence. More precisely, it examines a ritual that appears everywhere in H.P. Lovecraft's fiction, yet is never fully described in any published story. Readers encounter its aftermath, its prerequisites, its failures, and its consequences, but never its procedure. This is not accidental. Between roughly 1917 and 1936, Lovecraft developed a consistent strategy of omission, one that treats ritual not as spectacle or instruction, but as a structural pressure exerted on narrative itself. We must pause here. Lovecraft was writing at a moment when anthropology, astronomy, and early physics were unsettling inherited ideas of human centrality. Fraser's comparative ritual studies circulated alongside popular astronomy texts. The universe was expanding, meaning was not. In this context, ritual became dangerous, not because it promised power, but because it implied that human action could align with processes that had no interest in human outcomes. This investigation approaches the forbidden ritual as a composite phenomenon. We will trace its historical roots, analyze its linguistic residues, and examine how it functions across multiple stories without ever stabilizing into a single form. We will compare Lovecraft's strategy to earlier religious mysteries and later fictional expansions, noting where clarity weakens the effect he carefully preserved. Consider this carefully. To follow these implications is already to participate, not by performing anything, but by accepting a frame in which understanding does not grant control. The ritual, as Lovecraft constructs it, does not require belief. Attention is sufficient. H.P. Lovecraft's approach to ritual cannot be separated from the intellectual environment in which he wrote. Between 1917 and 1936, Western thought was undergoing a quiet destabilization. Einstein's theories had fractured absolute time. Anthropology was dismantling linear narratives of civilization, and astronomy was expanding the scale of the universe beyond any humanly intuitive frame. Lovecraft followed these developments closely. His letters reveal sustained engagement with popular science journals, amateur astronomy, and comparative anthropology. This matters because ritual, in his fiction, emerges as a response to scale. Not as a means of control, but as a misaligned human attempt to interface with forces whose operations predate culture, belief, and even biology. Lovecraft's creator intent becomes clearer when contrasted with the occult revival contemporaneous to his career. Groups such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, along with popularized theosophy, framed ritual as a technology of ascent. Lovecraft rejected this premise outright. He viewed ritual belief as a cognitive error inherited from pre-scientific cultures. Yet he did not dismiss ritual as irrelevant. Instead, he reconceived it as mechanically accurate but interpretively false. According to this logic, rituals work only insofar as they coincide with pre-existing cosmic conditions. They do nothing. They merely happen at the wrong time to the wrong species. We must pause here. Lovecraft's refusal to describe full rituals was not due to ignorance or squeamishness. It was a deliberate aesthetic and philosophical choice. In multiple letters from the early 1920s, he criticizes writers who turn cosmic forces into theatrical magic. Procedural detail, he believed, domesticates horror. Once a ritual can be performed step by step, it implies reproducibility, and reproducibility implies mastery. Lovecraft's horror depends on denying that implication. His rituals remain implied because implication preserves asymmetry between human intention and cosmic outcome. Publishing context reinforced this restraint. Pulp magazines rewarded vivid action, not metaphysical ambiguity. Lovecraft repeatedly chose the latter, even at the cost of marketability. When rituals appear, they are mediated through police reports, academic testimony, or secondhand recollection. This narrative distance matters. It frames ritual as an object of post-event analysis rather than lived experience. The reader encounters data, not drama. That choice aligns with Lovecraft's self-conception as a rational materialist, documenting irrational consequences. Historical precedent also shaped his approach. Late Victorian anthropology, especially Fraser's The Golden Bough, 1890, treated ritual as a fossilized survival of earlier thought systems. Lovecraft absorbed this view, but inverted its implication. For Fraser, ritual persisted because cultures lagged behind reason. For Lovecraft, ritual persisted because reason itself was insufficient. Scientific progress did not eliminate ritual. It revealed that ritual had never been symbolic in the first place. It had always been a misread description of processes too large to conceptualize. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft's ritual is not a moral problem, nor a spiritual one. It is an epistemic one. Humans perform rituals because they mistake correlation for causation, symbolism for mechanism, intention for relevance. The danger lies not in summoning something forbidden, but in realizing that nothing was summoned at all. The universe was already operating. The ritual simply marked the moment when human perception fell briefly into alignment with an inhuman pattern. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's intent was not to frighten readers with hidden ceremonies, but to erode confidence in explanatory frameworks. Ritual functions as a narrative pressure point, where anthropology, science, and myth collapse into one another without resolution. By refusing to describe the ritual, Lovecraft forces the reader into the same position as his scholars and investigators. Aware that something structured occurred, yet unable to translate that structure into usable knowledge. This subsection establishes the foundation for what follows. Having situated Lovecraft's omissions within his historical moment and philosophical commitments, we can now examine the deeper traditions he was drawing from. The next section turns to the cultural and philosophical antecedents that made such a conception of ritual not only possible, but inevitable. Lovecraft did not invent his conception of ritual in isolation. He inherited a fractured intellectual tradition in which ritual had already lost its theological certainty, but not its cultural persistence. By the late 19th century, Western scholarship increasingly treated ritual as a historical artifact rather than a living conduit to transcendence. Comparative religion, especially after 1870, reframed rites as remnants of obsolete cosmologies. This shift matters. Ritual became something to be cataloged, not practiced, analyzed, not believed. Lovecraft absorbed this academic posture and translated it into fiction, where ritual survives as a residue of older explanatory systems that no longer align with modern scientific understanding. Ancient mystery traditions provide an instructive contrast. The Eleusinian mysteries, active for nearly a millennium, promised revelation through secrecy, repetition, and controlled silence. Yet their purpose was ultimately human-centered. Reassurance about death, continuity, and belonging. Lovecraft reverses this orientation. His rituals promise no consolation and offer no initiation into community. They dissolve individuality rather than reinforce it. Where ancient rites stabilized meaning, Lovecraftian ritual destabilizes it. This difference signals a philosophical break. Ritual is no longer a bridge between human and divine orders. It is evidence that no such bridge was ever structurally sound. We must pause here. Medieval grimoires complicate this lineage. Texts such as the Key of Solomon or Picatrix present ritual as technical knowledge, procedural, repeatable, and oriented toward control. Lovecraft was familiar with this tradition, but he systematically negated its assumptions. His forbidden books resemble grimoires in form, but not in function. They catalog conditions, timings, and correspondences, yet they never guarantee outcomes. The reader expects instruction. Instead, they encounter implication. The ritual appears scientific in structure, but fails scientifically in purpose, producing effects without explanatory closure. Philosophically, this aligns with 19th century pessimism. Schopenhauer's conception of an indifferent will and Nietzsche's critique of teleology both undermine the idea that human intention matters at cosmic scales. Lovecraft extends this logic. Ritual, in his fiction, is not an assertion of will against chaos, but a demonstration of will's irrelevance. Not a method of influence, but a misinterpretation of coincidence. This is not mysticism returning under another name, but materialism pushed to a psychologically intolerable conclusion. Anthropology further shaped this view. Fraser's evolutionary model suggested that ritual preceded religion, which in turn preceded science. Lovecraft quietly collapses this sequence. In his fiction, ritual persists alongside science because both are attempts to map reality using inadequate symbolic systems. The difference is rhetorical, not structural. Ritual fails visibly. Science fails gradually. Both, when pressed beyond human scale, reveal gaps that cannot be resolved by additional data. Astronomical traditions provide another antecedent. Ancient star cults aligned rites with solstices, equinoxes, and planetary conjunctions. These rituals did not compel the cosmos. They synchronized with it. Lovecraft adopts this logic precisely. His rituals succeed only when conditions are already correct. Timing replaces intention. Alignment replaces belief. The ritual does not act on the universe. It marks humanity's accidental proximity to processes that remain unaffected by observation. Consider this carefully. These antecedents converge on a single implication. Ritual persists because it addresses a cognitive need rather than a metaphysical reality. Humans seek patterns that reassure them of relevance. Lovecraft strips ritual of that reassurance while preserving its formal structure. What remains is a hollow mechanism, precise, inherited, and catastrophically misinterpreted. This prepares the ground for a closer examination of language itself. If ritual survives as structure without meaning, its vocabulary must also reflect that erosion. The next subsection turns to etymology and symbolic language, tracing how Lovecraft's invented lexicon encodes ritual not as command, but as corrupted description. Lovecraft's treatment of ritual becomes most visible at the level of language. He did not merely avoid describing ceremonies. He systematically stripped ritual vocabulary of its traditional functions. Across stories written between 1921 and 1935, familiar religious verbs, pray, invoke, bless, are conspicuously absent or displaced. In their place appear terms borrowed from mathematics, physics, and engineering: angles, dimensions, conjunctions. This lexical shift matters. It signals that ritual, in Lovecraft's framework, is no longer a symbolic exchange between humans and gods. It is a misapplied technical description of processes that were never symbolic to begin with. We must pause here. Traditional ritual language presumes agency on both sides. Someone performs an action, something responds. Lovecraft removes this reciprocity. His sentences favor passive constructions. It was known, it was said, it was aligned. Agency dissolves. No subject commands the verb. This grammatical flattening mirrors the philosophical claim beneath it. Ritual does not persuade or compel. It coincides. Not an act of communication, but a moment of accidental correspondence between incompatible systems. The Necronomicon exemplifies this linguistic strategy. Although framed as a grimoire, it consistently fails to function like one. Grimoires promise clarity through specificity. Lovecraft's Forbidden Book offers density without instruction. Its language clusters around three recurring categories: timing, geometry, and location, without ever resolving into procedure. The book speaks of cycles, of alignments, of thresholds. It never explains how to cross them. This is not withholding for suspense. It reflects a deeper claim. The language itself is inadequate to encode what it references. Comparisons sharpen this point. Medieval magical texts, such as the Ars Goetia, rely on precise naming. To name a spirit is to delimit it. Lovecraft's entities resist names altogether, or bear names that describe function rather than identity. Yog-Sothoth is not a personality. It is a relational term. This resembles certain strands of pre-Socratic philosophy, where words described processes rather than beings. The similarity is structural, not historical. Both confront phenomena that cannot be stabilized as objects. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's invented words often appear untranslatable, even within the fiction. Characters pronounce them incorrectly. Transcriptions vary. This instability is deliberate. In linguistic terms, the signifier refuses to settle. Ritual language becomes archaeological debris, symbols detached from the contexts that once made them intelligible. According to anthropological theory, emerging in the early 20th century, such drift signals cultural collapse. Lovecraft repurposes that idea cosmologically. Meaning erodes because it was never grounded in human cognition to begin with. There is also a notable absence of moral vocabulary. Rituals are never described as evil or blasphemous by neutral narrators. Those judgments appear only in human reactions. The ritual itself remains ethically inert. This reveals something profound. By removing moral qualifiers, Lovecraft positions ritual as a descriptive error rather than a transgression. Humans mislabel neutral processes because they lack categories for non-human causality. Rhetorical questions emerge naturally at this point. If ritual language no longer commands, what does it do? It records. It preserves partial observations of recurring phenomena using symbols that degrade over time. Not a code to be deciphered, but a fossilized interface that no longer matches the system it once approximated. The horror lies in recognizing that greater precision would not restore meaning. It would only confirm irrelevance. This linguistic erosion prepares the final step in Part 1. If ritual language survives as damaged structure, how does Lovecraft maintain narrative credibility without explicit explanation? The next subsection examines how myth-building through omission creates authenticity precisely by refusing to resolve what language can no longer hold. Lovecraft's myth-making succeeds not through accumulation of detail, but through disciplined absence. He understood that explicit explanation weakens speculative systems by forcing them into human proportions. This insight aligns with early 20th century anthropology, which warned that over-documentation of ritual often stripped it of cultural power. Lovecraft applies this principle narratively. By refusing to stage rituals directly, he preserves their scale. What the reader encounters instead are fragments, testimonies, translations, academic summaries. These indirect forms simulate historical research rather than dramatic revelation, lending the mythos an air of documentary credibility. Narrative mediation plays a central role. Rituals are never witnessed by reliable observers in stable conditions. They are reconstructed after the fact through police reports, newspaper clippings, or scholarly correspondence. This distance matters. It positions ritual as an object of inquiry rather than experience. The reader receives data filtered through institutional language, legal, academic, bureaucratic, which was familiar to Lovecraft's contemporaries as a marker of seriousness. The effect is subtle but decisive. The ritual feels real because it is treated as something that has already exceeded comprehension. We must pause here. Lovecraft's avoidance of ritual scenes was not merely aesthetic restraint. It was a strategy for preserving mythic authenticity. In folklore studies, myths lose authority when their origins are too clearly traceable. Lovecraft exploits this dynamic. His rituals appear ancient not because they are described as such, but because no origin story can be located. They seem older than narrative itself. Not X, but Y. Not mysterious because they are hidden, but because no narrative position exists from which they could be fully seen. This approach contrasts sharply with later expansions of the mythos. Subsequent writers often attempted to codify rituals, supplying chants, gestures, and outcomes. These additions made the system more accessible, but less convincing. Once a ritual can be replicated on the page, it becomes fictional in a narrower sense. Lovecraft's restraint prevents that collapse. His mythos feels incomplete in the same way historical records feel incomplete, through loss, erosion, and distortion rather than authorial omission. The structure of his stories reinforces this effect. Rituals are always temporally displaced. They occur before the narrative begins or after it ends. The story occupies the aftermath. This framing mirrors archaeological practice, where meaning is inferred from ruins rather than observed in use. According to cultural historians writing in the 1910s and 1920s, ruins provoke imagination precisely because they resist reconstruction. Lovecraft transforms ritual into narrative ruin. What remains is enough to prove occurrence, not enough to explain function. Consider this carefully. Mythic credibility depends on limits. A system that explains itself entirely feels artificial. Lovecraft's mythos refuses closure, and that refusal signals authenticity. The reader senses that something larger exists beyond the text, inaccessible by design. This is not teasing. It is structural honesty. The stories acknowledge that any human account of non-human processes must be partial. There is also a psychological dimension. By withholding ritual detail, Lovecraft shifts responsibility onto the reader. The mind attempts to complete the missing procedure, drawing unconsciously on cultural memories of ceremony, sacrifice, and invocation. This participatory gap implicates the audience without granting them power. They imagine but cannot act. The ritual remains unperformable, even in thought. That frustration is integral to the horror. Comparisons clarify the stakes. Classical myth often explains the origin of rituals to anchor them socially. Lovecraft removes that anchor. His rituals float free of community, purpose, and meaning. They persist without justification. This reveals something profound. Authenticity in cosmic horror does not arise from coherence, but from the consistent refusal to supply it. This subsection completes the groundwork for Part 1. Having established how Lovecraft builds ritual credibility through silence, we are prepared to examine what these rituals actually signify. The next part turns from origins to function, analyzing the philosophical themes that make ritual not a narrative device, but a structural feature of cosmic indifference. Lovecraft's ritual logic rests on a single philosophical premise. Human insignificance is not a theme, but a condition. This distinction matters. Insignificance, in his fiction, does not arise from defeat or punishment. It precedes action altogether. Rituals fail not because they are performed incorrectly, but because correctness is irrelevant at cosmic scale. As Lovecraft wrote in a 1927 letter, the universe is a blind, mechanical chaos without responsibility. Rituals emerge as human attempts to impose narrative order on processes that operate without reference to observers. This is not nihilism as despair. It is cosmology as indifference. Entropy provides the second pillar. Lovecraft's rituals never build or preserve. They erode. Their outcomes include madness, social collapse, and perceptual breakdown. But these are secondary effects. The primary result is informational decay, meaning disperses. Systems lose coherence. This aligns with early 20th century thermodynamic thinking, which Lovecraft encountered through popular science writing after 1915. Entropy, in this context, is not merely physical decline, but epistemic exhaustion. Ritual does not summon catastrophe. It accelerates the revelation that structure was always provisional. We must pause here. Dream reality complicates this framework. Lovecraft consistently destabilizes the boundary between waking, perception, and dream experience, particularly in stories written after 1926. Dreams are not symbolic spaces. They are alternate informational regimes governed by different constraints. Rituals often operate at this boundary. They induce states where causality loosens and spatial logic collapses. A character reports angles that were not angles, a phrase that recurs across multiple texts. This is not metaphor. It is a failed description of perceptual overload when cognition encounters incompatible geometries. Insignificance, entropy, and dream reality form a triadic system. Each reinforces the others. Insignificance removes agency. Entropy removes stability. Dream reality removes verification. Together, they ensure that ritual cannot be mastered even in principle. Consider this carefully. If a ritual produces consistent effects but cannot be consciously understood, does it count as knowledge? Lovecraft's answer is implicit. Knowledge without applicability is not empowering. It is corrosive. Comparisons sharpen this insight. Traditional religious rituals aim to stabilize reality through repetition. Even chaos-oriented mythologies, such as certain Gnostic systems, offer escape narratives. Lovecraft offers neither. His rituals resemble scientific experiments conducted without hypotheses, controls, or interpretive frameworks. Results occur. Meaning does not follow. This resemblance is not accidental. It reflects a broader modern anxiety that data accumulation does not guarantee comprehension, a concern already visible in scientific discourse by the 1930s. Fictional quotations within the mythos reinforce this logic. In The Call of Cthulhu, a cultist claims the right was only to wait. Waiting is not action. It is temporal alignment. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, ritual geometry allows transit, but not understanding. The protagonist travels, yet learns nothing usable. These moments illustrate a consistent pattern. Rituals succeed operationally and fail cognitively, not powerful but precise, not revelatory but disintegrative. Rhetorical questions arise naturally. Why persist in ritual if it offers no mastery? Because it promises proximity. Humans accept annihilation of meaning if it grants even fleeting alignment with something larger. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror does not depict fear of death. It depicts fear of accurate perception. Ritual becomes the mechanism by which perception briefly exceeds its design limits. This subsection establishes the conceptual framework governing all subsequent analysis. Ritual operates where insignificance, entropy, and dream logic intersect, producing effects without explanation. The next section turns from abstract principles to the entities and forces implicated in this process, examining how Lovecraft constructs beings that neither receive nor respond to ritual action. Lovecraft's rituals are often assumed to be directed toward entities. This assumption collapses under close reading. The Old Ones, Outer Gods, and Dreamland's beings do not occupy the role traditionally assigned to ritual recipients. They do not listen, judge, or respond. They persist. Rituals intersect their presence incidentally, like instruments passing through a field that remains unchanged. This distinction matters. The entities are not summoned. They are already there, operating at scales that render summoning a category error rather than a failed technique. We must pause here. Lovecraft consistently avoids portraying entities as participants in ritual scenes. In The Call of Cthulhu, the cult chants, but Cthulhu does not acknowledge them. The narrator stresses that the rite meant nothing unless the stars were right. This conditional clause reverses ritual logic. The determining factor is not devotion or precision, but cosmic configuration. Cthulhu's emergence, partial and temporary, results from planetary alignment, not human intention. The entity is not awakened. Human perception briefly intersects a process already underway. Yog-Sothoth clarifies this framework further. Described as the gate and the key, Yog-Sothoth is not an entity in the conventional sense. It is a relational structure linking time, space, and probability. Rituals associated with Yog-Sothoth resemble mathematical operations rather than invocations. In the Dunwich Horror, the rite does not call Yog-Sothoth into being. It exposes a pre-existing connection that humans misinterpret as access. The force involved does not arrive. It is revealed momentarily through catastrophic misalignment of perception. Azathoth occupies an even more destabilizing position. Often imagined as a god, Azathoth functions instead as a cosmological constant. The blind idiot god is not blind in a sensory sense, but indifferent in a structural one. Rituals associated with Azathoth do not engage it at all. They orbit its presence as meaningless gestures. The famous image of flute playing, attendance is frequently misread as worship. In context, it resembles maintenance noise, a stabilizing oscillation preventing total collapse. Humans mistake background processes for ceremony. Dreamland's beings complicate the picture without resolving it. Unlike the Old Ones, they sometimes interact with humans, speak, or guide, yet they do not understand the rituals they facilitate. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, knowledge is traded, paths are shown, but no ritual produces control. Dreamland's entities function as intermediaries trapped within systems they did not design. Their partial comprehension mirrors human ignorance rather than transcending it. They are closer to custodians than gods. Consider this carefully. Rituals involving these forces consistently fail to establish reciprocity. Not X, but Y. Not communication, but coincidence. When effects occur, they are side effects of alignment, not responses to appeal. A fictional grimoire fragment describes the rite as a turning of the lens, not a voice raised. This phrasing captures Lovecraft's intent. Ritual adjusts perspective. It does not transmit requests. The entities remain unaffected, unaltered and unaware. Comparison sharpened the contrast. In traditional polytheistic systems, gods require attention to sustain relevance. Even in hostile mythologies, divine forces react to neglect or insult. Lovecraft's entities do neither. They persist regardless of observation. This aligns them more closely with physical laws than mythic personalities. Gravity does not respond to prayer. Nuclear decay does not accelerate out of spite. Lovecraft extends this logic imaginatively, constructing beings whose presence is functionally indistinguishable from natural constants. The psychological impact of this design is significant. Humans involved in rituals often believe they are addressing entities when they are merely synchronizing with impersonal forces. This misinterpretation generates cult structures, hierarchies, and mythologies that have no bearing on outcomes. The entities neither reward nor punish these errors. They remain untouched. Madness arises not from divine wrath, but from the collapse of explanatory models that assume agency where none exists. Rhetorical questions become unavoidable. If no entity receives the ritual, why does the ritual persist? Because humans require narratives of address. Ritual supplies a grammar for confronting scale without understanding it. The entities function as placeholders for incomprehensible systems. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror does not strip the universe of gods. It reveals that gods, as conceived, were never structurally capable of interacting with the universe in the way humans required. This subsection clarifies a crucial point. Rituals do not fail because the entities are hostile. They fail because the entities are irrelevant to the ritual's premise. With this in mind, we can now examine the human side of the equation. The next section turns to madness, analyzing how human cognition responds when ritual reveals forces that cannot acknowledge being addressed at all. Lovecraft's portrayal of madness is inseparable from ritual participation, but not in the manner commonly assumed. Madness is not a punishment for transgression, nor a moral consequence of forbidden curiosity. It is a functional outcome of cognitive overload. Human minds encounter information structured for no human frame of reference. The result is not fear alone, but systematic failure of interpretive capacity. Ritual acts as the trigger because it places cognition in direct alignment with processes that exceed perceptual design limits. We must pause here. Lovecraft consistently rejects madness as emotional excess. His characters do not lose their minds because they panic. They lose them because their explanatory models collapse. In The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, the narrator describes knowledge that could not be fitted into any known mental category. This phrasing is precise. The problem is not trauma, but classification failure. Ritual accelerates this collapse by stripping away symbolic buffers, religion, myth, narrative, that normally mediate experience. Ritual participation also destabilizes memory. Survivors rarely recall procedures clearly. They remember sensations, fragments, and spatial distortions. This is not narrative convenience. It reflects the incompatibility between human memory structures and non-human processes. Memory encodes sequence and causality. Ritual encounters dissolve both. As one fictional account notes, the steps were known only while they occurred. Knowledge evaporates the moment it is no longer aligned with the conditions that produced it. Madness, in this framework, functions as an epistemic filter. Those who fully comprehend too much do not survive intact. Those who survive cannot fully articulate what they encountered. This dual failure preserves the secrecy of the ritual without intentional concealment. Not X, but Y. Not insanity as chaos, but insanity as enforced truncation of awareness. The mind sheds incompatible data to preserve basic functionality. What remains appears irrational only because the missing context cannot be restored. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's cultists often appear functional within their communities. They chant, organize, and persist across generations. Their madness is selective. It does not impair daily life. It distorts cosmological interpretation. They mistake coincidence for intention, alignment for favor. This selective dysfunction sustains ritual repetition. The cult survives precisely because it never fully understands what it is doing. Total comprehension would end participation altogether. Comparisons clarify the mechanism. In classical tragedy, madness follows moral violation. In Lovecraft, madness follows accurate perception. This inversion marks a shift from ethical to cognitive horror. The terror lies in realizing that sanity depends on limitation. To remain functional, humans must not perceive reality accurately at all scales. Ritual breaks that protective barrier, briefly and irreversibly. Rhetorical questions emerge naturally. Why do some characters seek ritual despite known consequences? Because ritual promises certainty, even if that certainty is annihilating. Lovecraft's protagonists are often scholars, antiquarians, or scientists, individuals trained to value truth over comfort. Ritual becomes the final experiment. The outcome confirms a hypothesis they cannot survive testing. This analysis prepares the final movement of Part 2. Madness reveals the cost of interaction, but it does not explain why knowledge itself proves corrosive. The next subsection turns to forbidden knowledge and epistemic collapse, examining why information gained through ritual cannot be integrated, transmitted, or safely retained within human systems at all. Lovecraft's concept of forbidden knowledge differs sharply from earlier literary traditions. Knowledge is not prohibited because it is morally corrupting or socially destabilizing. It is forbidden because it cannot be integrated into human epistemic systems without causing collapse. This distinction is central. Characters do not suffer because they learn something evil. They suffer because they learn something structurally incompatible with how knowledge is normally organized, validated, and transmitted. Ritual serves as the access point because it bypasses interpretive safeguards, exposing cognition directly to unmediated information. We must pause here. In Lovecraft's fiction, knowledge does not accumulate. It disintegrates frameworks. Scholars encounter data that cannot be hierarchized, contextualized, or verified. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, the narrator insists that certain facts must not be made public, not out of fear of panic, but because the facts undermine foundational assumptions about history, biology, and purpose. This is epistemic collapse. Knowledge ceases to function as a tool for explanation and becomes instead a solvent that dissolves coherence. Ritual knowledge accelerates this process. Unlike textual study, ritual knowledge is situational and conditional. It exists only when specific alignments occur. Outside those conditions, it cannot be recalled or reproduced. This produces a paradox. The more accurate the knowledge, the less portable it becomes. A fictional marginal note in the Necronomicon states that what is learned is lost when the angles change. The implication is clear. Truth in Lovecraft's universe is local, temporary, and hostile to abstraction. Consider this carefully. Human epistemology depends on generalization. Laws, theories, and models must apply beyond singular instances. Ritual-derived knowledge refuses this expansion. Each occurrence is unique, bound to unrepeatable configurations of time and space. Not X, but Y. Not secret knowledge hoarded by elites, but knowledge that actively resists preservation. Attempts to systematize it produce errors, cultic distortions, and false traditions that persist precisely because they no longer correspond to reality. Comparisons sharpen the stakes. Enlightenment science assumes that more data leads to better understanding. Gnostic traditions assume that hidden knowledge leads to liberation. Lovecraft rejects both trajectories. His forbidden knowledge leads nowhere. It closes paths rather than opening them. The investigator does not ascend. He stalls, trapped between awareness and utility. This position is psychologically untenable. Hence the recurring insistence that manuscripts be destroyed, expeditions silenced, and testimonies suppressed. Epistemic collapse also explains the instability of Lovecraft's mythos. Facts contradict one another across stories. Dates blur. Entities overlap. This is not careless world-building. It reflects the inability of human narrative to stabilize information drawn from incompatible ontological layers. Knowledge fractures as it crosses scales. Each retelling degrades precision while preserving terror. The system remains frightening because it cannot be finalized. Rhetorical questions emerge unavoidably. If knowledge cannot be integrated or transmitted, why pursue it at all? Because Lovecraft's characters are compelled by the modern conviction that reality must be intelligible. Ritual exploits this conviction. It offers access without comprehension. The result is not enlightenment, but rupture. This subsection completes Part 2's thematic analysis. Ritual exposes the limits of human knowing, producing knowledge that cannot function as knowledge. The next part turns to literary manifestation, examining how these abstract principles appear concretely across Lovecraft's stories, embedded in narrative structure rather than explicit exposition. The forbidden ritual does not enter Lovecraft's fiction fully formed. It emerges gradually, dispersed across early stories as implication rather than event. One of the earliest instances appears in Dagon, 1917, where the narrator encounters a monolith carved with non-human symbols and describes a compulsion to perform gestures he cannot later recall. No ritual is staged, yet the language suggests procedural memory without conscious access. The encounter establishes a pattern. Ritual knowledge exists prior to articulation, activated by proximity rather than instruction. This anticipates later works in which characters act correctly without understanding why. A similar mechanism appears in The Statement of Randolph Carter, 1919. Carter's final testimony alludes to the rite which should not be named, performed in a burial ground under specific conditions. The story withholds every operational detail, focusing instead on the consequence, disembodiment, and perceptual rupture. What matters narratively is not what Carter did, but that the act placed him beyond human sensory limits. The ritual functions as a narrative hinge, moving the story from investigation to irreversible loss. We must pause here. These early appearances establish a crucial rule. Rituals are never primary plot drivers. They occur off-stage, often before the story begins, and their traces surface only through aftermath. This structural choice repeats across texts. In The Festival, 1923, the narrator participates in an ancestral rite whose steps he follows instinctively, guided by lineage rather than knowledge. He later admits that he could not have told the order of the chanting if his life depended on it. This confession signals a recurring motif: ritual competence without recall. Intertextual connections reinforce the sense of a shared but unarticulated procedure. References to the right season, the proper stars, and ancient customs recur across geographically and narratively distinct stories. These phrases are never defined, yet they function consistently. They indicate conditional thresholds rather than instructions. According to Lovecraft's correspondence from the mid-1920s, this repetition was intentional. He sought what he called a background of fixed external laws, without ever enumerating those laws explicitly. Consider this carefully. The Necronomicon appears early as a unifying object, but not as a source of clarity. In The Hound, 1922, it is cited as confirmation rather than explanation. Characters consult it to verify what they already fear, not to learn what to do. The book connects stories without standardizing ritual practice. Each reference adds density while preserving ambiguity. This technique mirrors how real historical texts accrue authority through citation rather than comprehension. Comparisons illuminate the strategy. In traditional myth cycles, repeated references gradually clarify cosmology. Lovecraft reverses this process. Repetition increases uncertainty. Each new appearance confirms that a pattern exists while denying access to its logic. This is not inconsistency. It is cumulative destabilization. The reader senses coherence without ever locating it. By the late 1920s, particularly in stories like The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, these dispersed elements coalesce into a planetary pattern. Cult rituals occur independently across continents, synchronized by stellar conditions rather than coordination. The intertextual implication is unmistakable. A single ritual logic operates beneath cultural variation. Humans do not invent it. They approximate it imperfectly, guided by fragments inherited across time. This subsection demonstrates that the forbidden ritual is not introduced through exposition, but assembled through recurrence. Its earliest appearances establish narrative rules that later stories refine without violating. Having traced these foundational connections, we can now turn to a focused case study. The next subsection examines The Call of Cthulhu in detail, analyzing how Lovecraft uses ritual absence to structure a global myth without ever revealing its core procedure. The Call of Cthulhu, written 1926, published 1928, represents Lovecraft's most concentrated deployment of ritual without revelation. The story is often remembered for its cosmic scale and iconic entity, but its structural engine is ritual omission. At no point does Lovecraft describe a complete ceremonial act. Instead, he assembles a global pattern of partial enactments whose coherence emerges only after catastrophic consequences. The ritual exists everywhere and nowhere at once, functioning as a planetary condition rather than a localized event. The Louisiana swamp raid provides the clearest example. Police interrupt a nocturnal gathering where cultists chant phrases transcribed phonetically as Fung Louis Malwanaf, Cthulhu Rillier, Wagahnagl Ftagen. The chant is quoted, but nothing else is explained. No gestures, no sequence, no stated objective. Inspector Legrasse reports only that the participants danced and howled and sang around an idol. This vagueness is deliberate. The chant is not a spell. It is a linguistic residue of alignment, preserved without comprehension. The cultists repeat sounds that function regardless of understanding. We must pause here. Lovecraft immediately undermines the apparent centrality of this ritual by revealing its irrelevance in isolation. The gathering accomplishes nothing. Cthulhu does not rise. The ritual fails, yet remains structurally correct. The narrator later learns why. The stars were not right. This single sentence redefines ritual logic. Human action is neither sufficient nor necessary. Ritual is conditional synchronization, dependent on astronomical configuration rather than devotion or accuracy. The cult did not err. The universe was simply misaligned. The second ritual layer appears through dreams. Artists and sensitives across the world experience simultaneous visions during the same period. No contact occurs between them. No coordination is implied. Yet the experiences align temporally with seismic disturbances near R'lyeh. This constitutes a non-ritual ritual. No chanting, no gathering, no intention. Perception itself becomes the medium. Lovecraft suggests that ritual can occur without performance, activated by exposure to planetary conditions rather than human planning. Consider this carefully. When R'lyeh rises, it is not summoned. The sailors who encounter it perform nothing. They stumble into alignment. Johansson's testimony describes no ceremony, only disorientation and spatial contradiction. The city's emergence fulfills the same function the cult sought, yet occurs independently of them. This parallel reveals the ritual's true nature. Not invocation, but coincidence. Not human-centered causation, but incidental proximity to cosmic process. The narrative structure reinforces this logic. The story is assembled from documents, a professor's notes, a police report, a sailor's manuscript. No single perspective captures the whole. This fragmentation mirrors the ritual itself. Each participant holds a fragment that only becomes meaningful in aggregate, and even then, meaning remains incomplete. The ritual's existence is inferred, not witnessed. Comparisons sharpen the insight. In traditional horror, rituals climax in confrontation. Here, the climax bypasses ritual entirely. The cultists are irrelevant at the decisive moment. Their chants anticipate an event they do not control. This inversion reveals something profound. Ritual does not move the cosmos. It misleads humans into thinking they participate in its timing. The Call of Cthulhu thus establishes the definitive Lovecraftian ritual model. Global in effect, absent in description, and indifferent to human intent. It marks the point where ritual becomes environmental rather than ceremonial. Having seen this logic at planetary scale, we can now turn to a more intimate case. The next subsection examines the Dunwich horror, where ritual operates not through cult convergence, but through academic procedure and catastrophic partial correction. The Dunwich horror, written 1928 to 1929, published 1929, reframes ritual through institutional procedure rather than cultic performance. Where the Call of Cthulhu disperses ritual across continents, Dunwich localizes it within an academic and familial lineage. The story's central ritual is never staged as a ceremony. It unfolds through inheritance, study, and correction. The result is a narrative in which ritual appears not as invocation, but as administrative failure within human knowledge systems. The earliest ritual act occurs before the story begins. Wilbur Whately's grandfather conducts experiments described only as wizardry, aligned with obscure texts. The narrator provides no steps, no incantations, and no sequence. Instead, we are told of results: an invisible offspring, abnormal growth, and spatial disturbance. This narrative choice matters. The ritual is defined entirely by consequence. The act itself is inaccessible, reinforcing Lovecraft's pattern of displacement. Ritual is something that has already happened, leaving a problem to be managed rather than a spectacle to witness. We must pause here. The story's most revealing ritual moment is corrective, not generative. Dr. Armitage's counter-ritual, performed atop Sentinel Hill, appears to resemble a traditional banishment. Yet Lovecraft again refuses full description. We hear of a formula, powdered salts, and strange devices, but the emphasis remains on interpretation rather than mechanics. Armitage reads, adjusts, and responds. His ritual resembles experimental troubleshooting more than magical confrontation. He is not summoning power. He is attempting damage control after a prior misalignment. Consider this carefully. Armitage's speech during the ritual offers the closest approximation to explanation in Lovecraft's fiction. He addresses Yog-Sothoth not as a deity, but as a condition, the gate and the key. This phrasing matters. It reframes the ritual as spatial negotiation rather than moral struggle. The invisible entity rampaging across Dunwich is not evil. It is misplaced. The ritual seeks not to destroy it, but to render it imperceptible again, restoring a fragile equilibrium. The narrative function of this ritual is inversion. In most horror, rituals unleash danger. Here, ritual limits damage. Yet even this success is partial. Armitage's intervention does not resolve the underlying condition. It merely seals a breach temporarily. The cosmic system remains unchanged. Human knowledge proves sufficient only to recognize error, not to correct it permanently. The ritual succeeds operationally and fails philosophically. Quotations underscore this ambiguity. Armitage admits that what he has learned ought not to be. This is not moral condemnation. It is epistemic despair. Knowledge has revealed a truth that cannot be incorporated into human frameworks. The ritual stabilizes the town, but destabilizes understanding. The cost of intervention is expanded awareness without utility. Comparisons clarify the evolution from earlier stories. Unlike the Call of Cthulhu, where ritual anticipates emergence, Dunwich depicts ritual as aftercare. The shift reflects Lovecraft's growing interest in institutional knowledge, libraries, universities, archives, as ritual actors. Books, formulas, and measurements replace chanting crowds. The danger persists because academic precision remains insufficient at cosmic scale. This case study demonstrates that Lovecraft's ritual concept evolves without clarifying. It migrates from cult to campus, from swamp to library, while preserving its core logic: alignment without control, intervention without resolution. With this evolution established, the next subsection examines how later collaborators attempted to codify what Lovecraft left unstable, and why those attempts fundamentally alter the ritual's function within the mythos. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, the forbidden ritual faced its greatest threat: clarification. August Derleth and other collaborators inherited a system defined by absence and attempted to stabilize it. Their intentions were preservative, but the results were transformative. In codifying rituals, they altered their function. What had operated as an epistemic hazard became a mechanical device. This shift matters because it reveals what Lovecraft had deliberately avoided: ritual that explains itself. Derleth's most consequential intervention was moralization. He reframed the mythos as a conflict between benevolent elder gods and malignant old ones, introducing ritual as a defensive or purifying act. In stories such as The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, rituals are described with procedural clarity and ethical purpose. This reorientation imposes teleology. Ritual now aims at protection or banishment. Lovecraft's system had none, not X, but Y. Not alignment within different processes, but opposition between moral forces. The change resolves tension at the cost of philosophical depth. We must pause here. Codification also enters through structure. Later writers specify ingredients, chants, symbols, and outcomes. This proceduralization makes ritual reproducible. Reproducibility implies mastery. Lovecraft's rituals resisted this implication by remaining incomplete. Once steps are enumerated, failure can be attributed to error rather than irrelevance. The universe becomes legible again. Horror contracts accordingly. Games and role-playing systems accelerate this transformation. Beginning in the late 20th century, ritual becomes a mechanic with costs, probabilities, and effects. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, influential as it is, translates ritual into rules. Sanity loss replaces epistemic collapse. Outcomes become predictable within statistical ranges. This adaptation is understandable, but it reveals the fragility of Lovecraft's design. Ritual cannot survive intact once it becomes playable. Consider this carefully. Even well-intentioned expansions often mistake silence for incompleteness rather than structure. Lovecraft's omissions are not gaps awaiting content. They are load-bearing absences. Filling them changes the system's behavior. The mythos begins to resemble traditional fantasy, where knowledge confers advantage. Lovecraft's central claim, that knowledge erodes agency, is quietly reversed. Comparisons sharpen the distinction. Tolkien's mythos gains coherence through elaboration. Lovecraft's loses coherence when treated the same way. The difference lies in purpose. Tolkien builds a secondary world meant to be inhabited. Lovecraft sketches a reality meant to remain uninhabitable. Ritual. Clarity invites participation. Ritual opacity enforces distance. Some later authors resist this trend. Writers like Thomas Ligotti echo Lovecraft's refusal to specify, preserving ritual as implication rather than act. Their work suggests that Lovecraft's true legacy lies not in named entities or codified rites, but in methodological restraint. The most faithful expansions preserve uncertainty rather than resolve it. This subsection completes Part 3 by demonstrating how the forbidden ritual mutates under external pressure. Attempts to stabilize it reveal why Lovecraft left it unstable. With this literary evolution established, we now turn to the ritual's afterlife beyond fiction. Part 4 examines how these ideas migrate into modern culture, hoaxes, adaptations, and psychological frameworks that continue to repeat the ritual's logic, often without recognizing it. The forbidden ritual persists beyond Lovecraft's texts because it maps cleanly onto modern myth-making mechanisms. Urban legends, hoaxes, and alleged sightings reproduce the ritual's logic without reproducing its content. Consider the recurring claim that the Necronomicon exists in suppressed editions, locked archives, or private collections. Since at least the late 1960s, most visibly after the publication of the so-called Simon Necronomicon in 1977, readers have reported rituals that almost worked, dreams that felt aligned, and instructions that could not be recalled afterward. The pattern matters. These accounts emphasize proximity and aftermath rather than procedure, mirroring Lovecraft's original strategy of omission. Internet folklore intensifies this dynamic. Creepypasta rituals circulate with deliberately incomplete instructions, steps omitted, timings blurred, outcomes hinted at but never stabilized. The ritual survives as a template rather than a script. Online communities repeat phrases like, "Do not attempt unless conditions are right," without defining those conditions. This vagueness is not accidental. It sustains participation by preventing falsification. A failed attempt can always be attributed to misalignment rather than error. The ritual remains intact because it never becomes testable. We must pause here. Alleged real sightings often follow the same structure. Reports of unusual lights, non-Euclidean architecture, or mass dream events spike around culturally significant dates. Millennial turnovers, eclipses, planetary conjunctions. The 1997 Hale-Bopp comet and the 2012 Mayan calendar panic generated clusters of testimonies describing a sense that something was meant to happen. Nothing definitive occurred, yet belief persisted. These moments function as secular rituals. No action is required beyond attention. Alignment replaces participation. Consider this carefully. Urban legends rarely describe success. They describe interruption. Someone stopped the ritual. Authorities intervened. The recorder fled. This narrative structure preserves danger while avoiding verification. Not X, but Y. Not proof that the ritual works, but proof that it cannot be safely completed. The absence of completion becomes the evidence. The legend survives because its core remains inaccessible. Digital culture introduces a further layer through alternate reality games and viral challenges. ARGs borrow Lovecraftian logic explicitly, embedding puzzles that require collective effort without guaranteeing resolution. Participants feel complicit simply by observing patterns, decoding fragments, and waiting for signals. The ritual here is cognitive rather than physical. It asks players to synchronize interpretation, not action. When projects collapse or end ambiguously, forums fill with speculation that the final condition was never met. The ritual persists as a failed alignment rather than a finished event. Comparisons to older folklore sharpen the point. Traditional urban legends warn against specific acts, visiting a place, saying a name, breaking a rule. Lovecraftian legends warn against understanding too much. The danger shifts from behavior to perception. This aligns with broader modern anxieties about information overload and algorithmic patterning. When systems behave unpredictably, people search for hidden procedures. Ritual offers a narrative for explaining correlation without causation. Rhetorical questions arise naturally. Why do these myths endure despite repeated debunking? Because debunking addresses claims, not structures. The ritual does not depend on belief. It depends on the suggestion that meaning might emerge if conditions align. Attention is sufficient. Participation is optional. The urban legend form thus becomes the ritual's modern vessel. It preserves incompleteness, resists verification, and implicates observers without empowering them. These stories do not invite action. They invite vigilance. Something might happen. Something almost did. The implication remains open, and as long as it does, the ritual continues, distributed across rumors, timestamps, and waiting minds, without ever needing to be performed. Modern adaptations of Lovecraftian ritual reveal a persistent tension between representation and erasure. Visual media, by its nature, pressures creators to show what Lovecraft refused to describe. This pressure often produces spectacle at the cost of structure. Films such as The Color Out of Space, 2019, or Annihilation, 2018 gesture toward ritualized processes, zones, transformations, alignments, without staging ceremonies directly. The emphasis shifts from action to environment. Ritual becomes atmospheric rather than procedural, suggesting that exposure itself is the operative mechanism. We must pause here. When films attempt explicit ritual depiction, the effect often collapses. Clear chanting, symbols, and climactic gestures reintroduce agency and intention. The universe appears to respond. This reverses Lovecraft's logic. Horror becomes transactional. By contrast, works that preserve ambiguity, lingering shots, unresolved sequences, incomplete explanations, approximate the original effect more closely. The most successful adaptations do not show rituals working. They show characters waiting, watching, and failing to interpret outcomes. Games present a different challenge. Interactivity demands rules. The Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game translates ritual into mechanics, costs, sanity loss, probabilities. This is a functional necessity, but it alters meaning. Ritual becomes a risk-reward calculation rather than an epistemic hazard. Digital games such as Bloodborne or Darkest Dungeon resist this reduction partially by obscuring systems and withholding feedback. Players perform actions without fully understanding their consequences. The ritual persists as a hidden variable rather than a mastered technique. Consider this carefully. Music provides one of the most faithful translation mediums precisely because it avoids representation. Experimental and dark ambient composers, Lustmord, Atrium Carcery, Sun O, construct ritual atmospheres without narrative closure. Repetition, low-frequency oscillation, and unresolved progression evoke alignment without event. The listener experiences duration rather than climax. Nothing happens. That is the point. The ritual is temporal, not narrative. Comparisons clarify the pattern. Traditional horror scores build toward resolution. Lovecraftian-inspired music suspends it. This mirrors the difference between ritual as performance and ritual as condition. Sound operates where language fails. It suggests scale without specifying form. In this sense, music becomes an ideal carrier for cosmic horror's central claim. Meaning does not arrive on schedule. Modern internet video culture adds another layer. Analog horror series and found footage compilations rely on degradation, looping, and missing context. Rituals are implied through timestamps, repeated broadcasts, or corrupted signals. Viewers piece together patterns that never resolve. The ritual exists in the act of interpretation. Watching becomes participation, even when nothing conclusive occurs. Rhetorical questions follow naturally. Why do these adaptations persist despite frequent failures to capture Lovecraft's effect? Because each medium exposes a different limit. Film struggles with visibility. Games struggle with agency. Music and abstract media succeed by embracing absence. The ritual endures because it adapts to constraint, not because it survives explanation. This subsection demonstrates that modern adaptations function as experiments in containment. Some collapse the ritual into spectacle. Others preserve its core by refusing closure. Together, they show why Lovecraft's omission remains difficult to replicate. With this cultural transmission established, the next section turns to appropriation, examining how academic, occult, and subcultural communities reinterpret ritual as metaphor, method, or warning, often without recognizing which function they have chosen. Lovecraft's forbidden ritual persists in contemporary culture not only through fiction, but through interpretation. Subcultural and academic communities appropriate it as metaphor, method, or cautionary device, often without acknowledging that these roles are mutually exclusive. Occult subcultures provide the most literal example. Since the mid-20th century, fragments of Lovecraft's mythos have been absorbed into modern magical practice, stripped of their fictional framing. Rituals inspired by the Necronomicon circulate in zines, forums, and private groups, treated as symbolic experiments rather than narrative artifacts. This appropriation misunderstands Lovecraft's intent, yet reproduces his structure, incomplete procedures, conditional success, and unverifiable outcomes. We must pause here. These practices rarely claim effectiveness in conventional terms. Practitioners report altered perception, vivid dreams, or a sense of alignment rather than concrete results. This matters. Even in misinterpretation, the ritual resists instrumentalization. It produces subjective disturbance without objective confirmation. The structure survives because it never delivers what is promised. Participants remain suspended between belief and doubt, mirroring Lovecraft's epistemic trap. Academic appropriations operate differently. In literary studies, ritual becomes a tool for analyzing modernity's crisis of meaning. Scholars frame Lovecraftian ritual as a response to disenchantment, where scientific rationality dissolves inherited cosmologies without replacing them. Anthropologists and philosophers reference his work when discussing anti-ritual, procedures that expose the limits of symbolic action. Here, ritual is no longer something characters perform. It is something texts enact upon readers by destabilizing interpretive confidence. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's work appears increasingly in discussions of epistemology and philosophy of science. His rituals are cited as fictional analogues to paradigm shifts, where existing models fail catastrophically rather than gradually. The comparison is not decorative. It reflects a shared concern. What happens when explanatory systems encounter phenomena they cannot assimilate? In this context, ritual names the moment of breakdown rather than the attempt at control. Subcultural theory offers another layer. Internet communities devoted to liminal spaces, analog horror, or backrooms mythology frequently adopt ritual language without explicit reference to Lovecraft. Terms like threshold, alignment, and wrong geometry circulate as descriptors of affect rather than belief. These communities do not seek transcendence. They seek orientation within systems that feel impersonal and automated. Ritual becomes a vocabulary for navigating environments that resist interpretation. Comparisons clarify the distinction. Traditional religious rituals reinforce communal identity. Lovecraftian rituals fracture it. They isolate participants within private experiences that cannot be shared coherently. This inversion explains their appeal in fragmented digital cultures. The ritual offers a way to articulate alienation without resolving it. Rhetorical questions emerge naturally. Why do these appropriations persist across incompatible domains? Because the ritual functions less as content than as structure. It models what it means to confront scale without mediation. Whether misread as occult practice or reinterpreted as literary metaphor, it performs the same work. It destabilizes confidence in mastery. This subsection shows that appropriation does not dilute Lovecraft's ritual. It extends it. Each reuse repeats the original error, treating alignment as agency, access as understanding. The ritual survives precisely because it cannot be settled into a single function. With this in mind, the final subsection turns inward, examining why the ritual continues to resonate psychologically and philosophically, long after its fictional origins fade from view. The forbidden ritual endures because it articulates a psychological limit that modern culture repeatedly encounters and cannot resolve. It stages the moment when understanding ceases to function as reassurance. Unlike traditional horror, which threatens the body or the social order, Lovecraft's ritual threatens cognition itself. It suggests that accurate perception may be incompatible with continued psychological stability. This implication remains unsettling precisely because it contradicts the modern assumption that more knowledge is always beneficial. We must pause here. The ritual does not traumatize through shock. It corrodes through clarity. Characters who glimpse alignment do not describe terror first. They describe recognition. The horror follows later, when that recognition cannot be integrated into daily life. This sequence mirrors contemporary anxieties surrounding large-scale systems, climate modeling, algorithmic decision-making, cosmology, where understanding increases alongside helplessness. The ritual persists because it provides a narrative form for this mismatch between awareness and agency. Philosophically, the ritual undermines Enlightenment confidence in explanation. Knowledge traditionally promises prediction, control, or moral orientation. Lovecraft withdraws all three. What remains is comprehension without consequence, not X, but Y, not ignorance as danger, but knowledge as destabilizer. This inversion places his work in dialogue with 20th century pessimism, from Schopenhauer's will to post-war existentialism, while refusing their consolations. There is no escape through meaning-making. The ritual exposes meaning as local, temporary, and scale-bound. Consider this carefully. The ritual also reframes curiosity in earlier traditions. Forbidden knowledge tempts because it promises power. Here, it tempts because it promises accuracy. Humans are drawn to the possibility that the universe might finally make sense, even if that sense excludes them. The ritual survives because it speaks to this impulse. It does not offer transformation. It offers confirmation that exclusion was always the rule. Psychologically, this produces a distinctive unease. The ritual suggests that sanity is not a baseline state, but an adaptive fiction. Cognitive stability depends on ignoring most of reality. When ritual alignment briefly removes those filters, the mind experiences overload rather than revelation. This resonates with contemporary research into perception, which increasingly emphasizes constraint over completeness. The brain survives by omission. Lovecraft's ritual dramatizes what happens when that strategy fails. Comparisons clarify the universality of this concern. Religious apocalypse narratives resolve tension through judgment or renewal. Scientific utopias resolve it through progress. Lovecraft resolves nothing. His ritual reveals continuity without purpose. The universe proceeds unchanged, indifferent to recognition. This refusal of narrative closure distinguishes cosmic horror from despair narratives. There is no final catastrophe, only ongoing misalignment. Rhetorical questions remain unanswered. If the ritual changes nothing, why does it matter? Because it changes perspective irreversibly. Once alignment is glimpsed, return is impossible. The ritual does not end. It recedes, leaving cognition permanently altered. This is its true danger. The philosophical implication remains open. If human understanding is structurally limited, then the desire to exceed those limits may itself be maladaptive. Yet the ritual continues to reappear across cultures, media, and disciplines. It suggests that restraint is as difficult as ignorance. The final implication is not that the ritual must be avoided, but that it may already be underway. Whenever attention drifts beyond the scale for which meaning was designed,